Welcome to the Pleasure Points podcast. I am your host, James Rohr. Thanks for being here. If this is your first time listening to the show, I am an acupuncturist and dating coach and energy interventionist, all things focused on helping you get the most pleasure that you possibly can from this life. And today's episode, I'm super stoked. I got to sit down with a good friend of mine named Andrey, who is a food scientist, a philosopher, just an all-around solid dude, interested in all sorts of things. And we had a great conversation ranging from meditation to dating to comfort and states of mind. We talked about food. Mezcal was had. I really enjoyed it. I hope you guys enjoy it too. Thank you so much for being here. And let's welcome Andrey to the show. Welcome, Andrey, to the podcast.
Hi, how are you?
Super stoked that you're here.
Nice, me too.
So Andrey is holding the Osho book. It's the book of 112 meditation. What's the title?
It's called 112 Meditations to Discover the Mystery Within.
The Book of Secrets.
The Book of Secrets.
It's like 1,000 pages. It's huge. It's awesome though, because he gives he'll talk about specific meditations and then he'll give like a whole teaching around it.
Yeah.
And so within it, there's like all these other teachings and things. And I haven't made it anywhere close through the whole thing, but one of the things that I loved about it is he says somewhere in there something like, if you find a meditation in here that I give you and it gives you good feelings, you know, it's easy and it makes you feel happy. He said, that's not the meditation for you to do. He's like, and if you find one that's very difficult and that's uncomfortable, he goes, that's your meditation.
He was a bit of a gadfly, right? He had a tendency to like poke at people's discomforts and kind of exploit the exploitable opportunities in both a good way, and then now he's getting a lot of backlash. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that at all.
Like the wild country stuff?
The wild country stuff, and I think the pendulum has really swung that people aren't thoughtfully reading Osho and giving their opinion on it. They've taken a very, I guess distilled perspective, and I think Wild Country was a good example of exposing something that we didn't think about otherwise. And we had looked at several different perspectives. I actually will admit that as somebody who doesn't have Netflix, people who know that I'm into Osho and like just not into Osho, but like have read and recommended it to people. Yeah. I think it was April 16th that it came out. And I think the day or two before, somebody messaged me and said, hey, if you want to borrow my Netflix account, an Osho documentary is coming out. And at that point, nobody had context. And I'm like, an Osho documentary, amazing. Yeah, I'm watching this. I think I sat down at like 5 p.m. the night it came out. And I guess binging is a thing people do, but I've never done it before. And I completely understood it from day one of touching that. And I watched, I think, every episode back to back. Yeah. I was like, it shook me. It moved me. And I think it moved me in a way that, well, I'm curious what your thoughts are before like I kind of share what.
I mean, I thought it was great. I love the whole absurdity of the whole thing. And I thought the documentary, like as a documentary, was cool in that like they didn't really talk about Osho. Like Osho was he was kind of a non-event. I mean, he was like the reason that they'd gathered, but the documentary really focused on his like the woman that was like running the show.
Right, Sheila.
So I thought that was cool. Like I didn't feel like the documentary was at all like an endorsement or of an indictment of Osho. And so in that sense, I thought it was cool because like hopefully the teachings can stand on their own.
Right.
When I think about it now, there's a few images that come to mind that like just made an impression there. And the one that comes to mind right now was I think it was the guy that was like his lawyer.
Yes.
And he just like, at one point he started crying, right? And like that moved me because I could just imagine being someone that was there and like, they would be like, fuck yeah, I want to go live there with these people and like have this experience, and have that experiment. So I didn't judge that. I mean, the poisoning of the people was like fucked up, it was like she, it sounds like she went rogue.
Yeah.
But not knowing exactly how much Osho knew about it is interesting too.
Yeah. And, there's an interesting aspect that I think it reveals about us in how we tell that story too, is that we have, we have a pyramid understanding of how power works. And we really want to believe that. And it's this idea that, an order comes down and that order trickles down to every single person below. And it's such a prejudice that we carry. And I think the flavor of that movie, I think your interpretation is how I saw it as well. Mm-hmm. But that movie that documentary skips over that in a sense, not because the documentary doesn't do it justice, but because we have such a prejudice towards accounting for the leadership or accounting for whoever the person on top is as the decision maker throughout. Mm-hmm. And even though, Osho was I think he was in a vow of silence throughout most of the time went through. And we all have it. And it's this just inadvertent way to be like, well, the guy whose name is on the door, or that's the accountability. And there's so many great examples in history where that wasn't the case. And I think so much of what we look at right now as, I think, issues, we're mobilizing a vote right now, mm-hmm. and everybody is very, very eager to go vote, but we're not also eager to, repair the communities that we have. Right. And we forget that, in my opinion, a vote, it's already too late. Once a vote takes place, the communal damage, the things, the expressions that people are expressing have already been done. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of the zeitgeist spirit of the situation. And people, whether people allowing things that are unjust to happen or allowing things that are immoral to happen really happen at the point of contact, right? Mm-hmm. At some point, I have to do something to you that otherwise my morality would not allow me to do. Mm-hmm. And that's, looking at that system is so fascinating for me, rather than looking at, who I voted for or who was my ideological master mm-hmm. when I committed that act. I'm so much more curious about where was my personhood mm-hmm. when I committed that act, rather than who I was following or attributing to. Mm-hmm. And I think mm-hmm. that's an interesting thing. I think, today I saw of all things, a Gandalf quote. And
nice, we got Osho and Gandalf in the first 5 minutes.
And it really struck me, as cheesy as a lot of the times those quotes are, and I wish I had the exact wording of it, and I don't, but it said that some people believe that power is the way that you regulate evil, that you put the good in power, and that good wields power in a benevolent way that then is able to keep evil under control. And he says, I don't believe that's true. I believe it's the individual acts of kindness and the individual interactions among people that are the only thing that can keep evil at bay. Mm-hmm. And power cannot. Fundamentally, I think is what that statement was expressing, and I liked it.
Yeah, I love that. Part of what I like about Osho. So my first interaction with Osho's teachings was the Book of Understanding, which is like, it's great. It's this little book, and it was the first thing that I ever read, like, in my sort of like adult life, where I was like, oh shit, like, this guy is like, he spent a ton of time thinking about shit that I like to think about, and he's like taking it, he had another 40 years of experience or whatever, and it was like, it was so moving and inspiring, and part of what I like about it is that there is this feeling of sort of like radical acceptance of like human nature. Yeah. Where it's like, don't try to keep evil down. Don't try to push it away. Like, invite it in. Like, Jordan and I were talking about that in our session, our podcast, where it's like, this ability to invite in all of these aspects that we don't like about ourselves, that we're afraid of, like it's jealousy or fear or whatever it is, greed. And instead of like trying to push it away or keep it at bay, it's like, no, let's just recognize that like this is inherent, and Chinese medicine with the yin and yang, the Tai Chi symbol, like, you can't have one without the other. And so rather than like turning a blind eye or like trying to grasp it, it's like, no, let's just let it all sort of flow, and befriend the sort of the shadow side. I don't like that phrase, but like, sort of open up your consciousness to accept that all of it is there. And the more we can treat it with sort of equanimity and not overreacting, that's like, to me, that's the highest level of living. I mean, being able to take that in and then to choose to come from a place of consideration and kindness,
Right.
Is for me like the highest level of showing up.
So how do we take that in? Like the thought of taking an evil, or let's bookmark that because I have an interesting thought on evil, but I think evil is to just, you've already swung the pendulum into a place of judgment that makes it difficult to deal with. But let's look at whether it's the shadow side or whether it's the uncomfortable, let's look at things like jealousy, or things that are perhaps undesirable, things that we want to share with our loved ones, right? Or people we care about, or our community.
Yeah.
Right? We don't want to bring in, or we feel we don't want to bring in anger. We don't want to bring in jealousy. We don't want to bring in, coveting and these kind of traits that we've given kind of implicit agreement that we're not happy with sitting in them for too long. So is the thought that we take them in, we invite them, we transmute them into something else, or is that too prescriptive?
For me, that's too prescriptive. For me, it's just like you sit with it, and like you choose to be in that uncomfortable place.
Yeah,
and like the analogy, it was actually an amazing thing because Jordana and I, like, we had both been doing the same practice with the same visualization, and we arrived to it completely differently. But the visual is that you invite these things in for tea. So she talked about Vipassana, how she'll, like, if jealousy were to come up, or fear or pain or whatever, you see it as like a figure, and then you invite it into your house, and you're like, okay, you get to go in this room where there's a tea party happening.
Yeah.
And like, I'll join you in there, and you can tell me all about yourself, and and then I'm going to move on. And part of what we both loved about that is that, like, when you're the host or the hostess, you're in charge. It's your party. And so you get to invite them in and then sort of dictate where you choose to spend the time.
Right.
But I don't think it's about transmuting it. I think I just don't think that's necessary. I think it's about recognizing that these things are going to show up, and then you get to make a choice as to how you want to respond to that.
Yeah.
And then eventually the idea is that, like, it's like maybe like an old friend that you grew up with, where you're kind of like, I know this person's deal, like, I've seen that story before, where it's like jealousy shows up, and it's like, I don't need to see you again. Like, I don't need to have tea with you anymore. I know what I see you, and then you don't have to engage as much.
Right.
But it's not a reactive thing. I think it's in the reactivity that's the problem.
There's an interesting thing that you said there that evokes seeing something. And seeing it in not its fullness, because you don't want to dwell on it. I guess you don't want to just over fixate in it. But when you turn your face away when something's uncomfortable, there's harm with it we do in the situation, and there's harm we do for our future self. And I wonder if there's something about giving something the opportunity to see it. You're inviting this uncomfortable feeling, you're inviting this state in for tea. You have to see it. You have to look at it, and you have to see other angles of it. You have to see other sides of it. And I appreciate that. I think there's value in that takes something that might be scarier than it really is and brings it into something to step through and acknowledge and go. And I guess the example that's popping up to me is, like, I bike a lot of the time in New York, and that can be an infuriating thing to do, because people, there's some people who are in a car who, when they make a mistake, can, end a life. There's some people who are pedestrians who, even if I make a mistake on a bike, I can harm them. And likewise, if they are careless and step into a bike lane, like, there's consequences, right? And consequences is when we get upset about a discomfort, right? If there's, if you lose $1 and you're well supplied with money, you're not going to be as upset if you're losing money that you really need for something. And I think this, there's a situation there where I'm biking, somebody cuts me off, and I've noticed that I feel that it's justified to be upset. It's justified to be angry. It's justified to go through that. But to observe myself in different states of being when what that seed of anger sprouts into is really fascinating. And some of the most interesting ones have been, I'm upset. I communicate that I'm upset and the possible consequences of the action that the driver did. And not trying to get anything out of them, not just being like, hey, let's talk about this. No, being like, what the hell? Like, you could have hurt somebody, like really genuinely, like looking them in the eye, communicating that, not out of a contrived state, but out of genuine, like, I'm upset right now and you messed up. You get a really nice response, and people generally pause and they say, shit, thank you. Like, or they go like, yeah, I fucked up. Like, I get it. And I'm going to go on my way. I'm busy too.
Yeah.
And then there's other times you freak out. And then there's other times where you go, I'm not supposed to get mad. I'm not supposed to get mad,
Yeah.
And I feel like the I'm not supposed to get mad is a bit of a violent act towards yourself. And the flip out is an alienating act. And the ripple you send that day is going to be one that, neither helps another bike rider in the future, nor makes you feel good. And there's an interesting thought there about prescriptiveness, that it's not prescriptive, and it almost cannot be prescriptive. And I feel like when you do make it prescriptive, you fall into that, like, people can tell when you're holding yourself and you're gauging an emotion. And that's been a mystery to me, of how to step through those cycles of human emotions. And some of them are undesirable, and some of them are ones we want to stop and bask in. And often when we do, there can be negative repercussions there too. But yeah, a genuine step through anger can be productive and not a bad look necessarily, and not something that both people walk away from in a bad way. But I just feel like I'm unwilling to put a prescription behind it of like how you act.
Totally. Yeah, I love that. I mean, and that's a lot of how I approach my practice in my life too. But it's sometimes I feel a little bad sometimes, like if clients are coming in for acupuncture, or if it's like, relationship or dating clients, and they speak of the discomfort they're in, that I don't like rush to a place of like, we need to get this to go away.
Yeah.
Instead it's like, okay, there's like sensation that's occurring. There's something, you're having an experience, and just like being in that, there's like a richness, and part of what I've tried to train myself to do, that's not even training, but I've paid attention to it, is like, how do I handle being uncomfortable?
Yeah.
And can I continue to be in that situation again and again and like be okay with it, And it's like, I have this one client, she's a new patient to me, and it's fascinating because I don't think I've ever had a patient where they just like are not hearing what I'm saying, like in any way. She's got wicked anxiety, and I feel bad for her. I mean, it's like she's suffering, but she's like, how do I get out of this? And I'm like, well, like you make a list of gratitude, and like turn your attention this way, like recognize there's a space between like the fucking thought and the reaction, and like, whatever. And she'll be like, no, like what do I do to get out of it? And I'll come up with like 3 other things, like, well, there's this essential oil, and there's this and this, and she's like, is this ever going to go away? Like, how am I ever going to get this to go away? And the other day I was just like, oh my God, fuck.
Yeah.
Like, you're so in it, but it's like, she's so focused on trying to get something to go away. And I don't really know how to support somebody in that.
Yeah.
Because at my core, I'm like, no, you want to bring that shit closer. And like, the less you spar with it, the faster it's going to change. But it's not going to change because you want it to change. It's going to change because you just greeted it with like love and kindness.
Yeah.
And it's like, but I don't know. I've referred her to Jordana. But she feels great after the treatment. She's like, oh my God, I feel like I'm myself again,
Right.
But then it's like, it's sort of short-lived, and I was like, listen, I was trying to prep her. I was like, you are going to feel uncomfortable again. Something is going to happen when you leave this room that's going to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So expect it. Don't be surprised when that happens. But the danger comes with like the story that you write about it and what you feed about it. Like, it's one thing, it's bad enough to just feel fucking anxious and bad. But when it's then, am I going to be institutionalized? Is this going to be my forever? And now all of a sudden it's like, it's a whole other thing.
That loop shortens real quick.
Ooh, it's bad, right?
I'm curious.
It's intense. I don't like that word bad. It's intense.
It's intense. Well, it's overwhelming. I can think of experiences when that feedback loop on both joy side and stress side has gotten really short, and it is overwhelming. Like, I don't care who you are. I don't care how you've dealt with stress and built techniques and practiced them. That feedback loop gets really short, and it gets real. But what I wanted to ask is, I'm wondering if you've ever, so you're saying that you step into it, you embrace the discomfort. Have you ever seen, so I feel like our bodies, our minds are these adapting creatures. They're systematizing and adapting little beasts that figure something out, and then they want to both systematize things, and then they want to digest them and make them no longer relevant. So when we know discomfort is a secondary trait, for example, we're not doing something because it's uncomfortable, right? We're doing something, and for the most part, the beneficial results will have a side consequence of discomfort. Have you ever found yourself, or have you worked with people whose mind displaces those goals and then becomes a seeker of discomfort because they've learned to believe that discomfort is a source towards healing, or is a source towards overcoming or becoming stronger?
Interesting. Yeah, probably. I mean, people that like cutters, people that cut themselves, but even people that
but even more subtle than that, like a runner, like a...
Yeah, sure. And I think it's also like people that are like addicted to self-help, like just believing that they need to be helped, believing that like they need to be improved.
Yeah.
I think is another form of that. It's like implicit in that whole movement is that you're not okay with who you are.
Yeah.
That you're not enough as you are right now. And that's dangerous. I thought about calling this podcast Self-Help is Bullshit. The irony being it's a bit of a self-help fucking podcast, but I certainly did that. I mean, for years, I believed that I needed to like live a certain way. I had to like sort of follow a set prescription in order to, be holy. So drinking like mezcal or, smoking weed or whatever, like would not be appropriate.
Right.
Is inconsistent with living a spiritual life.
Right. So you just had to do it in secret then.
Yeah, it's just all, right. You just have to fucking deal with the shame, It's like, that's all bullshit,
Right.
And that's what I love about Osho.
Yeah.
He might have had a vow of silence, but he was like, buy me some fucking, the Rolls Royces, like get me some nice cars. And I love that. Like, I love that, I love that if he was walking around with Rolls Royces and Rolexes, and he was also like just embracing all that there is to be had in this world.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think?
I think and I ask this really because it's something that I notice with myself a lot. I think that we get into acts or we get into practices that we don't yet know the outcome of. If we push into kind of our exploration of our being, we're going to necessarily get into practices that we don't know the outcome of. And we're going to need some ways to judge those outcomes. And there's an interesting thing where you build a lot of self-discipline in a category. I've noticed that the more self-discipline you build here, it tends to slip here. But that's another thing. I begin to use discomfort as a gauge of, am I on the right path? And
what does the discomfort tell you there? That you are on the right path, or that you're not?
That you are on the right path.
Right.
So,
so you're following the path of discomfort.
Right, but that's not how it started. It started with somebody says, okay, we're going to train for, a marathon, or we're going to learn we're going to learn another language. We're going to do these things that, and you go, this is really uncomfortable. And you learn that as you do it, the reward you get is it outweighs the discomfort. And not even just putting them directly to weight, but that discomfort becomes secondary. And the more you do that, I think something happens that again, and maybe it's my mind that wants to find systems for stuff all the time, that you start seeing, okay, maybe I seek the things that are uncomfortable, and in that I might discover something great. And there have been a few times where I look at myself and I'm like, no, you were just doing that and it's fucking uncomfortable and it's stupid. Like it's dumb. And sometimes I do it for fun, but I think there's a little danger to it. I think there's a little like you can go a little off the deep end, or I can go a little off the deep end. And I'm asking because it's something that I deal with every now and then. It's something that I wonder, like, okay, you're always looking for ways to grow, right? You're not because you think you're not enough, but because you're curious and you want to push into those things.
Ideally, right.
And you don't want discomfort to stop you. And you're almost taught that overly comfortable things, the ones that are like, this feels perfect. Like you get suspicious and you start saying like, okay, there's a trap. This is a drug. This is a trap.
Yeah.
And again, it's so subconscious and it's so subtle.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether there's not really an objective compass by which you can explore the unknown. Like stepping into the things you don't know the bounds of, you don't know the limits of, a thing where you don't know how your body, how your mind, your being is going to react. And I see that this idea of chasing discomfort is one that can be very dangerous.
Yeah, I love this side of the conversation because usually I'm talking about it on the other side.
Yeah.
Because I think that you and, perhaps myself too are like in the minority in that this sort of like embracing some discomfort or not letting that shy us away from things,
Yeah.
I think a lot of people they enjoy being comfortable. Like one of my teachers used to say that like that pursuit of comfort, that desire to be comfortable, that is the human state right now, is that people want to return back into the womb, basically, where everything's provided, everything's comfortable. I think that sometimes, at least in my experience with the relationship stuff, is that when people get in a relationship where things are like going really well and they're like, well, I'm really comfortable. Like if somebody has some anxiety or abandonment issues, they start to expect the bottom to drop out from them. Yeah. So then like weird sabotage behavior can arise and like all sorts of shit can pop up there. But just in sort of like an individual's kind of human pursuit, I think that it's finding that balance between that comfort and the discomfort. It was like, it reminded me, this whole thing, it's fascinating we're talking about this, is that my teacher who used to talk about this comfort shit, he, when I was really sick, so I used to have Crohn's disease. I was, ulcerative colitis and shit, and I was really, really sick. And I went to him, I was doing a vision quest, and he was like, why are you here? And I was like, well, I'm here because I want my guts to heal. And he was like, maybe you're here, because you have to decide if you want to live. And that was like, of course I want to live. I'm not suicidal, like it triggered this whole thing. And then there was this lesson about comfort and discomfort. And, he was like, most people just want to be comfortable, and he was like, and there's more to be found when you're okay with discomfort. Yeah. And I went out and I was, meditating and whatever on that for a few days. And I really struggled with it. I was having a really difficult time with it because I was trained as an acupuncturist. I had an acupuncture office. I was working I was like, my whole fucking job is to make people comfortable. Yeah. Is to do everything I can to help them be comfortable. And like this dude was a chiropractor. Like his job was to help people be comfortable. And for like 48 hours, I was grappling with this question and I was exhausting myself. I couldn't figure it out. And I was like, maybe you have to, my whole career is wrong. I just need to like put people in uncomfortable situations. And like, I should have like fucking podcasts where I ask people like hard questions.
Who you have to put into uncomfortable situations was your solution. Okay.
Well, because I was already in an uncomfortable situation.
Gotcha.
And I'll never forget like what happened. So I finally got to talk with him when I was done. And I was like, dude, what the fuck is this shit about comfort? I was like, you're a fucking chiropractor. I'm an acupuncturist. And he just looked at me with like this most genuine smile and like caring in his eyes. And he was like, sometimes it's just nice to be comfortable. He's like, life can be fucking hard sometimes. Yeah. And so if you can provide a little bit of comfort, it's okay.
For yourself.
Yeah. And for others.
For others.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. And it was just like, I mean, even not telling the story, I just feel everything sort of soften in me,
Yeah.
Where it was like, oh. Like it's okay, like it doesn't have to be like this constant like putting yourself in uncomfortable situations.
Right.
But that pursuit of constant comfort is what he was guarding against.
Right.
And, to bring it back to Osho, like I feel like my limited experience with Osho's teaching is that, and any kind of meditation in that way, where it's just like, yeah, accept what arrives. Even psychedelics, where it's just like, yeah, things can get weird.
Yeah.
So like, can you be in that place and like not need comfort at every moment? But if there's an opportunity to provide some comfort for somebody, especially if they're suffering, that's okay.
So it's interesting that you saw that towards other people, and you saw you found the place you had to give other people comfort. Did that reflect on how you gave yourself comfort?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in the sense that like I just kind of allowed myself to soften, and that like it was kind of along the same lines of this self-help, self-improvement loop that I'd been in.
Yeah.
Where it was like, no, that this doesn't matter as much,
Right.
And so the way I sort of like chunk all of this stuff down that we're talking about is like, I live by what I call my moment to moment purpose.
Yeah.
Because I can't, like, my brain's not big enough to handle like huge grandiose things and sort of prescriptions for everybody. And so, especially when I'm in like sticky situation, it's just like, okay, what can I do in this moment? And for me, my moment to moment purpose is to like bring a good mood, and to like be kind, be considerate. Intrinsic to that is being present as I can.
Yeah.
And then to really just to bring a good mood. And I have like, since I've committed to that in the last few years, like that's been a fucking lifesaver.
Yeah.
In all of my relationships, where it's just like, if I feel myself getting frustrated or like, stuff didn't go the way I thought it should have gone, whether because I created the situation or I'm observing somebody else's behavior, and just be like, okay, dude, what can you do right now to bring a good mood?
Right. To them.
And to myself.
Yeah.
Because ultimately I'm going to benefit from the good mood.
But so I guess the question was, do you find that your standard of how you comport yourself with other people, where you kind of find that value of saying like, you know what, I'm gonna bring a improvement to the mood, or I'm going to give people a small bit of comfort in this situational moment, and that will progress into, or it'll sprout into something else. Is that your top priority with yourself?
Oh, for sure.
It is.
1,000%.
Okay.
Yeah. So part of why I chunked it down into a moment to moment purpose, that's a great question, is whose podcast is this?
We've got Jim here today, and we're talking about some personal struggles he's gone through.
So the reason I like, and this is like what I do prescribe for my clients, which is like, having that moment to moment purpose is because if your purpose is dependent upon other people being around, you're fucked. Like, you're fucked.
Right.
You need to be surrounded by people. So like the example that I give is like, if somebody's purpose is to empower others, what does that mean in order for this person who wants to empower others to be fulfilled?
Yeah.
They have to have company. They have to have company of the people that like are not happy with their lot in life.
Yeah.
And that want to be empowered and that are willing to listen to whatever this person has to say.
Yeah.
They're going to implement it. They're going to then feel empowered, and then they're going to kick that feedback back to the person that they are now empowered.
Yeah.
That's like 6 or 7 steps in order for this person's purpose to feel fulfilled.
Right.
You're fucked. And so for me, it's like on a moment to moment purpose, I can like be brushing my teeth and be like, am I offering a good mood to myself?
Yeah.
Am I being kind to myself? Or am I having thoughts that are inconsistent with that? And it's a great tool to just sort of like audit my day. But to sort of circle back around, the way that I audit my day now is way more kinder after that conversation about comfort and discomfort. Because when he was like, sometimes it's just nice to be like comforted.
Yeah.
It was like, I realized that I hadn't let myself feel that way.
Right.
And that was a big part of why I was sick. Was that I was like so intrinsically tied to this story of suffering.
Right. And that's exactly what I was kind of scratching at. And the reason I was scratching it is because I think it's something that I wrestle with. And I certainly, like, part of my relationship with others is wanting also to give them, it's not my job, but it's something that I care about. I like to host dinners. I like to talk to people. I like to be there for them. I like to walk away from a person, them feeling, maybe it's not comfort, but them feeling like there's that they're sparking something that is going to make them happier, is going to make them feel a little bit better that day. And at the same time, I'm not overly like masochistic to myself, but I absolutely hold myself to a standard of firmness and a standard of discipline that I think I would find that if I did that to another person, I would see that as completely unacceptable behavior.
Yeah.
And it's not just I think it's very easy at that point for us to say, oh my God, you can't do that. You have to love yourself. You have to be kind to yourself. I think there's an interesting point at which we say, no, actually, you do want to be a little stricter with yourself. You do get to be a little more of a disciplinarian, a little more of like I always imagine like the cross monk, like the stereotypical like cross monk who's just a little grumpier than he should be. And just like that personhood be pushing you a little bit because you know what your goals are. You know where your discipline is. And I think I've found this, sometimes I go too far in it. Sometimes I I tried to do a solo Vipassana once, which is like a fasting solo Vipassana once, which is comedy. It actually wasn't comedy; it was torture. But it was something that really it split me into two people very quickly, and it was the prisoner, and it was the person who's imprisoning them. And it was a very clear two personalities, and it was a very clear two interactions of this person cares about this person's strength and perseverance and them overcoming into something greater. And that's where kind of that motivation and energy came from. And then the person imprisoned really didn't have a say. They just became more and more victimized until they became alienated. And I had to stop because it was the broad range was not me running and trying to do, an extra mile or like turn up the speed a little bit and go a little bit faster. That's a discipline where, again, I wouldn't, if I'm running with a friend, I wouldn't be like, you know what you need right now? You need a 10-minute pace and you do one more mile. That it would be really like, you would be crossing boundaries. But that for yourself is actually something that's beneficial and beautiful and you can get a lot out of it. But then there's a point at which we get carried away. And that dance is so delicate. But I do think you have to stay on the side of disciplining yourself much more and holding yourself to a standard where maybe comfort isn't your top priority always. Not to chase discomfort, not to chase pain, not to be masochistic because you think it will lead to something greater, but not get carried away with it.
I love this. Has that affected your relationships, like your intimate relationships?
So that was kind of going to be my next question to you, which was, you talked about people who are, whether it's fear of abandonment, whether it's this understanding of relationship has to be work, which I think it does. And I think it has to be work in a sense of not like we're working on this, or I'm working on something and then I'll come to you and you're working on something and then you'll come to me and we'll have the results and we'll build something great. But this idea that there has to be a little bit of tension and you can't prescribe it is the other caveat to it, because that's when I think consciously it's a little sociopathic and subconsciously it's a little, like the people I've known or I've dated who have had the most abandonment, they've been outward like, hey, I've got abandonment issues and this is something that you have to be aware of and it's important for me. Those are the same people who have, when things are really not good, like they're good and going towards a good flow and there's a rhythm or there's a tension that gets a little too scary, they're the ones that throw a little bit of a wrench. And
sure. They can't help themselves.
They can't. And it's almost so, and you see it too. It's not a very sophisticated mechanism.
Right.
It doesn't go 3 layers deep. Like it's
not a master manipulation. Who's this chick that you follow on Instagram?
It's like knee gets hit. The impulse goes just to the spine. It doesn't actually hit the brain. Right. It comes back and the knee goes up, right? We've had that at the doctor. And that's pointing into other people. And I've experienced that for sure. But on my side, I've had this subconscious but also conscious understanding of you want there to be a healthy tension. The problem is, I think my understanding of healthy tension might not be another person's understanding of healthy tension. And creating tension, again, I find it when you're sitting down and you're prescribing tension, you've already gone too far. When you look at some of your actions, you're like, well, why did I want to, stay 2 extra days on that camping site when we were like, we were cold, uncomfortable. It's like, no, I was just fucking around. I wanted to see how, and there's something in that which is fun. And
did you want to see how you react or how she was going to react?
We react.
Yeah. And then we is the third. Yeah.
I have had one of those, and it didn't go well. Because again, you don't know where the other person is, and they might be in a place where they're at the end of their line and patience. But I'm curious. One of the things you do is you talk to a lot of people about their relationships as well.
Right.
What's your thought on that? I mean, the thought on the hang-ups we have, like where we know that the one who fears abandonment may be the one who abandons first before they fear that trauma might come up.
Sure.
And we understand that. But then the other side where, what about the person who thinks there should be a little bit of tension? And what about the person who thinks that when it's too comfortable, not that it's too comfortable, but that there's is a great opportunity to test ourselves a little bit, or to put ourselves into a new situation where the world will put us into worse situations than we can imagine. And maybe it's fun right now to practice. And again, once you get that prescriptive, it sounds horrible, but it's really just looking at my own behavior over however many, 15, 18 years of dating, and seeing like, okay, why did I do that? And maybe it's my justification, but my thought process is like, well, we need to see how we will respond to these things. And again, saying it really does not do it any sort of justice, because I hear myself saying it right now, and I answer my own question with like, no, don't do that.
I'm glad you got there. Yeah, I'm curious what the if you could describe more of this healthy tension, and then I'll give you sort of my take on it.
So you're camping and you have no food, you have no water, and you throw away your compass. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. I was with you. I was like, yeah, I get it. Yeah.
No, but something like that, like putting yourselves into new situations where you didn't know, maybe both of you didn't think you liked them, but saying like, okay, we're maybe going to that same, trip that we've gone to, or maybe going to that same trip all of our friends have gone to is not as interesting right now. Maybe we take this opportunity to do something that's a little more difficult, that really challenges us, and maybe I know it'll challenge me, but maybe also challenge us together. And maybe it comes down to really properly communicating that first.
I think that's a huge part of it, is the communication, and like when it's done with like loving kindness, then I think you can kind of get away with almost anything as far as like, the kind of trips and adventures you want to take. To just sort of throw somebody into a situation like that is a bit shitty, it's like, it's a bit intense. But if there's a communication about it, to be like, hey, like, I think, I'd like to challenge ourselves. Like, there's huge value in that. I mean, one of the places that I have the greatest sort of empathy for people that are dating is, I believe that you don't really see someone's true character until they are under stress.
Yeah.
So I totally am with you in the sense of like, yeah, let's go on that camping trip and make it a little fucking difficult and see what happens there.
Yeah.
And part of the empathy that I have for people that are dating is that like, you meet somebody new, they're going to like put everything in a good light. You're probably going to have more kind of attraction to somebody who's already sort of got their shit together. But the problem with that is that you don't see that person under stress. And it might actually take 5 years or 7 years. Someone might have to get sick, or a parent might have to die, or like someone gets fired, these things that are like really intense.
Yeah.
And then you get to see like, how does this person handle this shit?
Right.
So it's like, I joked that like if Jen were my dating client, I would have told her to stay away from me, because we started dating as I was like going through this divorce, and it was like, but the huge value for her was that she got to see how I handled my shit.
Right.
And she got to hear how I talked about, my ex and how I handled the adversity. And there's massive value when you see someone almost or like pretty damn near at their breaking point. And if you like how they handle that, that says a lot. You know
It
what I mean?
does.
And so, and this is like where it comes back to that idea of like, sometimes it's just nice to be comfortable, is that now I would have a greater sensitivity to be like, okay, I might want to push this shit, but maybe they're at their breaking point. And so maybe I can offer a little more compassion, a little more understanding. And that might just be checking in with them and being like, hey, how you doing?
Right.
Like, are you okay? Like, I know this is a crazy fucking idea, but like, are you okay?
Right.
And if you're not, we'll leave. I care enough about you that like, I see where we went, and maybe the next trip or the next conversation or journey or whatever, you kind of push the boundaries a little bit further.
It's like it's 9 p.m. and somebody's in bed, like getting ready to go to bed, and you're getting dressed and like bumping some music, and you're like, all right, let's do this.
Yeah.
No, but it's funny because we're visually and auditory, that is an overt scene. We look at that scene, we're like, that's obscene. Like, what are you, there's a clear like blindness to the state. But I think when we talk about the subtleties of people's emotions, we've quieted those senses so much, and we've collapsed them to the realm of a one-dimensional form of communication, which is for the most part verbal. And so it's so much more difficult to tell when somebody is in their like self-care, I'm going to sleep right now, and you're in your, I want to go a little sideways and test and push myself and, see what the world's got to offer right now. And either person imposing that is very uncomfortable.
One of the things that I have very little tolerance for is a conversation about the weather and like the temperature, like in the temperature in a room or the temperature in a cab or the temperature in a restaurant. Like,
right.
I don't give a shit. Like, the temperature is the temperature. You either prepared for it or you didn't. And if you didn't, don't make it anybody else's problem. Like, this is where I get to be an asshole,
Yeah.
But like, that's like, cause it's like I listen to all these like fucking people talk all the time about like whether or not they're comfortable. And it's like, for fuck's sake, what else could we talk about here? Like, you either prepared or you didn't. If you didn't prepare for it, like, what the fuck's that about? And like, if you're unprepared and you're uncomfortable, like, just deal with it.
So do you want to talk about that, Jen?
And so like, Jen's amazing, right? She puts up with my shit and my fucking things. And so she'll sometimes say shit, just be like, oh, fuck, I'm cold. And then she'll be like, but temperature doesn't affect me. I'm fine. Which is sort of like the best case scenario that I could have. So, yeah. But, it's like, but I also like, I'll have that sensitivity where it's like, I'll anticipate and stuff. And just also being a dad helps me to do that too. Like, that's probably changed my sort of approach and understanding of comfort more than anything else.
Right.
Where it's just like, yeah, okay, like, sometimes people fucking, they just can't do it.
Right.
For whatever reason, they just can't. They can't find a fucking equilibrium. And if I can offer a good mood, don't be an asshole because someone's bitching about the room's too hot or the room's too cold. Just be compassionate.
Right.
Don't be a dick.
It's really I think this analogy came up a few times. It's the seed you plant and you nourish, right? So potentially you can't make it any warmer. Potentially you can't provide any clothes. But what you can do is you can nourish this idea of other comforts, of acknowledging that somebody is uncomfortable for whatever reason, whether it's a legitimate reason for your own discomfort or not.
Right.
And not over fixate on it, not over become supplicating on it, but feed that beast rather than feed the one that spirals down into like how uncomfortable we are and how, and I think there's that makes the world of a difference, the direction we face. And, needing less than you have or making sure you always have more than you need is you can be in the exact same state, but the direction of where you're facing, whether you're solving your problem by acquiring something or whether you're acknowledging the state and you're accepting the state for as long as you need to be in it, makes the world of a difference. And I think there's an element of, you mentioned psychedelics earlier, and there's been, no shortage of times where I've been with people who go through challenging times, and I've gone through challenging times. And one of the things that actually of all cliche moments we can bring up at Burning Man that struck me, actually 2 years ago when we were both there together, when we were on a journey, is that I started seeing these loops, these repeating cycles we're through. You know, we crave something and we go after it, and then we'll fulfill that craving. And then what's really interesting is that sensation of craving remains intact, and it just shifts towards another object or another thing. And as we continue to feed it, we can keep feeding it and keep shortening that cycle, or we can acknowledge that that's a human state, and that's when we focused on it. And we've been given a lot of reason to focus on that particular fixation more than others. But this thing came over me, this idea came over me of seeing that as a cruel joke or this like just cruel circus of a journey versus seeing it as a ceremony to unfold through. And a ceremony is something you do over and over. You know, you do it every Friday, you do it whenever, and you savor it. You don't artificially savor it, you savor it through it being a ceremony. The same act can be exhibiting of a state of hell if you see it as a cruel joke, if you see it as this just circus you can't escape from, that you have to go through the cycles of, or a beautiful ceremony that you can sit in. Explaining it doesn't do it justice. Talking about it doesn't do it justice. It's when you're forced to practice it. And the beauty of certain psychedelics is that they allow you to practice that cycle at a much quicker pace. And they allow you to step through it and then observe it. You know, they allow you to see that craving cycle of, you know, I'm too cold. I'm too cold right now. I know I'm too cold. And then you go back to your RV and you go back to your tent and you grab your jacket, you put it on, you walk outside, and you're like, whew. Okay, and then you put the jacket down and you're like, oh, I need some music. Some music. And I don't need the jacket after all. And getting to observe that is so powerful. Because I think in the way we go about fulfilling our cravings in the environment we're in, living in New York, living in the communities we're living in, is that you have 5 or 6 of those types of cravings going in at the same time. They're a little convoluted among others. Sometimes you don't recognize them. Sometimes you don't recognize that once you fulfill the craving, that sensation's exactly the same because it's kind of intertwined with another. And we just go through it. And we miss that opportunity to notice ourselves going through a loop and then talk to ourselves of how we want to go through that loop. You know, an extreme environment like a desert, but not even a desert, even doing mushrooms or doing LSD in nature, I think allows you to engage with that cycle and not just engage with it, but observe it and then test it again and again and again. Because the interesting thing is that craving for a jacket feels as extreme as, you know, the most important thing that you go through in life. Like, you know, if you're somebody who's at the age of having kids and that's the thing you've always wanted, and that sensation when it becomes really real, you know, your desire for a lollipop will be that real when you're on a journey. And it can, again, you can see that as a cruel joke. Like, that's fucked up. Like, why would you want to do that? Or you can be like, oh, okay, that's interesting because this is me going through the sensation of a craving, and this is me getting to see myself in that sensation because I will have that sensation towards other things. And I will have to cope with myself being in that state other times. And having that perspective, I think, is so powerful.
Yeah. And there's like a thing about stakes involved too. You know, it's like I think about some of the journeys that I've been on where it's like, you know, this one time it was like, okay, I want to go to the beach and I want to like surf or I want to like jump in the water. Yeah. And I like to think anyway that like I had enough awareness to be like, my existence doesn't like hinge upon that, but it would be fun. Yeah. You know, as opposed to like, I remember that night in Burning Man where we were journeying together and like you and I and Jen were kind of hanging on the back and we got to watch the rest of the group like follow their cravings, and it was like watching like a bunch of little kids or something where it was like it's like little light bulb, one of them get an idea and then like you try to enroll the other ones and be like, yeah, we got to go do that, and
then the sense of disappointment they had when they got it.
Like it was a fucking tragedy, you know, like if it didn't happen or even if it did happen, like that didn't feel how I thought it was going to feel. And you actually gave me one of the compliments that night that I was just like, it was one of the best compliments that I've ever gotten. It just hit at something that was such a core value to me, which was you said something like, you're like, yeah, man, it's nice to journey with somebody who like rides the waves like with grace. Something like that, or it's just like, it was basically like, yeah, dude, you don't freak the fuck out. It's nice.
Yeah, it is nice.
Because, it's like, there's like a different thing, and I was just so proud because it like reminded me of like the Sundances and shit that I've done where I was just like, I like to think that I've done a fair amount of training on myself to be able to like, and even at Ramit's place that one time, like where my mind is being blown and I'm just sitting by the fireplace and not like, giggling and then having to run out, just like keep your shit together.
Right.
Even though like, fucking dragons coming out of the fireplace. At one point I looked at Jen, I said, do you see the dragon in the fireplace? She was just like rubbing my back. She's like, no, babe, but it's all good.
And that's also a very beautiful, accepting place to be. But yeah, there's something about enjoying once you can appreciate that state and observe that state, then seeing where your discomfort is in that state. Because one thing I will say is that, in the way that I like to kind of test myself or explore myself, there have been times where, I've stepped into a journey in places where I knew that, not being careless, but knowing that I don't know what I would be like here. Yeah. I don't know what I'd be like in this state. And one thing I will say is, whether it's in ayahuasca journeys, whether it's in mushroom journeys, there is a limit. And I don't think that limit is permanent, but I think there's a place where, like there was a point where my younger self would say, push into it and see, like there's no boundaries you can't handle. And there really are. And there's certain states that, whether you do a dieta where you go out into the jungle for several weeks or whether you fast and meditate for 12 hours a day, there are states that will push you in ways that are, if you're self-aware enough, you'll come up to them and you'll say, I can't cross this boundary. If you're not, you'll lose yourself a little bit. And for me, learning that, and it's been a really recently learning that, there was a very long time where I really did believe that, you overcome everything, you push into everything. There's really no limit to which we can push ourselves if we do it right, not just like this careless. And what I've learned over the course of some years and practicing with people who I really respect, who held space for me to be able to do it, who I knew were taking care of me, but also pushing myself, was that there are limits. And those limits are very real. And that there is no ultimate strength. There is no ultimate endurance. There's a point at which we're going to break. We're going to fail. We're not going to be able to take it. And that's been a really fascinating thing to learn. And it's not one that I would suggest other people learn unless they're really interested in it. It's something that fascinates them and they're able to be responsible in it and they care about that. And a lot of people don't. I think it doesn't fascinate them.
Right.
But I think it's an important lesson to learn that our endurance is not infinite. And our endurance both in discomfort, in what we're able to handle, even I think what we're able to see as far as visions, as far as images that are not the standard states that we're in right now, whether it's holotropic states, whether it's psychedelic states, there really are limits that we can push up against that I think are real. And I would love for there to be enough discussion about this at some point in the future, for there to be enough of a culture of people responsibly exploring this and responsibly documenting it and keeping a trail of conversation that we can build upon that and navigate that world in a more thoughtful way. Because right now, we're not that we're careless about it, but we don't get the benefit of the compound interest of knowledge. If we're thinking of being explorers, for example, psychonauts,
yeah,
which out of context sounds like a horrible term, but going out as Vikings on a trireme, paddling somewhere, or Polynesian sailors who had just the tiniest ships that they would be able to go on, but they would share that knowledge and build upon that knowledge. And you would have this effect of compound interest that you could then do things that would have more understanding, and you'd be able to push yourself through those initial states of fear. And actually, Tim Leary and Ram Dass, who was Richard Alpert at the time, wrote a book that was essentially an entire copy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which isn't really the Book of the Dead. It's the Book of Bardo, the Book of Transitions. And they built it analogously to a psychedelic journey. And they found that those same transition points, those same forks in the road that you could go through in the mythology or the story of the Tibetan Book of Bardo, the Book of Transitions, was so analogous to their psychedelic states. And them being able to sit on that, that shoulder of that giant to see further, I imagine was immensely powerful. And us all taking these journeys in seeming isolation, or even the journeys people take in South America, that when they go and do ayahuasca journeys, there's a certain level of not compounding or not building upon previous experiences that I think would be a beautiful thing for us to have at some point.
Yeah, I love that. Man, there's so many things that popped in my head as you were talking. The one that I definitely want to talk about is like, the way you're speaking about coming up against limits reminds me of this word that's popular in the psychological world, which is attunement.
Yeah.
And there's something to be said about having that attunement with yourself. Like, where are you? It's like, you see it on a daily level, like with yoga. It's like, what can you handle today, right? A yoga teacher's like, where you are today may not have been where you were yesterday. It's like being attuned with your body.
Yeah.
But bring that into the relationship. So as we talk about comfort and stuff, it's like, are you being attuned to your partner and pushing in a way that like a responsible coach might? Or are you being kind of brash and selfish and like have this kind of agenda for pushing discomfort, even though some part of you deep down knows that like this person's already at their breaking point?
Right.
That's sort of the difference between, I think, a great relationship and one that won't make it, is like having that attunement. And you could recognize, hey, I want to go further. And you could even have that conversation and be like, hey, babe, if you need to like go back, or like go down to camp 3 or 2 or whatever, I'm going to keep going.
Right.
That's a conversation that can be had. But to bring somebody along to camp 4 when they're clearly not into it, is not offering a good mood.
Right. But that's all. It isn't. But that's assuming you speak the same language. Right. And one thing I recall is, when I was younger and I did swimming in both college and high school, I remember having good coaches and bad coaches. And the bad coaches were not bad coaches in and of themselves. They actually were great for some people, but they applied a lesson that they had seen work on another kid to me, or to another kid who it didn't work for whom that wasn't a motivating factor. And the key there was, like you're saying, going from camp to camp and not being ready. The key there is communication. And I think one of the fundamental things that is flawed is not, I don't think the flaw is in our verbal communication. I really don't. I think we over-depend on verbal communication. We over-depend on this sense. And we over-depend on the senses we generally talk about. Smell, sight, hearing, touch. We've taken these broad categories of senses and we've over-relied on them. And especially in this interpersonal state, those other states, senses don't even come in. It's all verbal. We've said the lowest common denominator of communication that we know we all have is language. And we're going to depend on that. And the hope is, you're essentially sending a message through a really tiny hole of a complex scene on this side and a complex scene on this side. And you're hoping you're, getting it through pixel by pixel. And it just doesn't happen. And I think one of the biggest shames is that we've neglected hundreds and hundreds of different senses we have and different modes of communication. I think humans have, I don't know how many types of communication, but we have possibly hundreds, possibly more than that, forms of communication in which we can see where the other person is, communicate something to that other person. But we've over-depended on the one that's the lowest common denominator. And I don't say lowest common denominator in a derogatory tone at all. I say it because it's a common form of language that we can say. And for example, when you're saying going from camp 3 to camp 4, I know what you're talking about there. And I know that, like, you know, the challenges you're talking about, and that there's a holistic way in which that may unfold, and there's an unknown element to that. But in language, it will be difficult to explain. So the same way that I think it's difficult to explain when you're telling somebody, you know, I want to keep attention in this relationship. I think that's a word, that's a linguistic representation of a state of wanting to be growing. Mm-hmm. And that linguistic state is a very poor representation. And especially when it's remembered or retold, it doesn't really express what it is that I'm craving. Mm-hmm. And certainly if I can't put in words what I'm craving, and I think you can't, and I think that's okay, because the language we have is fundamentally transactional. It's built around identifying objects and their limit, mm-hmm. and expressing how they can be transferred from one to another. If you look at the old, you know, the origins of language, the old Babylonian texts we have, the earliest texts we have are commerce. They are commerce, and commerce depends on delineation of this object, this space, delineation of this time, and delineation of the trade and how it takes place. And it's incredibly valuable, and you can do immensely powerful things on that. You can even build, you know, systems of mathematics, systems of engineering on that are fascinating. But what happens when you think that that form of communication is able to communicate everything within our state of being is you limit it and you cut it so short. And you can live within that state. And I think there's a lot of people who do, and I've met them, and they actually have really fascinating, interesting, complete relationships. Mm-hmm. But I think the second you open that Pandora's box, the second you allow yourself to experience other states, mm-hmm. which I think is almost impossible to not do. The second you do that, you get in touch with other ways of communication that you become immensely frustrated that you can't channel through this funnel of language. And we hold language as too high of an esteem to demand that it will be able to one day do that. Maybe it will. Mm-hmm. But I think that developing those other languages, especially in a relationship, especially in interpersonal relationships with friends, with family, with partners, and, you know, I hope to someday be able to experience that with kids as well, mm-hmm. I think is where there's so much potential and so much exploration. And it, to me, is much more fascinating than colonizing the moon or Mars. I think there's so much more fascinating exploratory work to be done there.
What are the 100 senses that you're talking about?
So I think herein lies the problem, because we've defined senses as input and output states, and ones that we can delineate and ones we can study. I think fundamentally the other states we're going to play with are ones we are so much of infants in that we have to think of them as, how would a 3-year-old think of language? It's not there yet, and we have to allow ourselves to be infants in those states. And we have to be, the way we learn it is not by saying, this is the language, this is how you talk in it, this is what you can express in it, because we're not there. Those other languages, you have to say, okay, what did I feel, or what did I experience, and how was it different, and hold that state and see if that state can grow into something else. Because again, this is an intuition, this is being in a journey state or being in a meditative state and tapping into other ways of being that I wasn't willing to say, okay, how do I describe this? But just let them sit, and let them sit in their own form. And what happens is they kind of grow a little bit, and they start building their own little foundation, and you start seeing these little states vibrating. And whether it's when you meditate and you close your eyes and you get visionary states, and those visionary states are fundamentally different than your vision, because those states can have 360-degree vision. They can have a holistic type of vision where it's not an object seeing a subject, it's an embedding vision. Like you become part of something that if you try to explain, you can do it poetically. And I think a lot of the mystics did. And I think a lot of the wisest mystics that have lived, whether it's in the Kabbalistic tradition, the Sufi tradition, the Gnostic tradition, they settled at poetry at the end of the day because they suspected that humans might have been greater than history gives them credit for. And they also knew that they're going to be greater than the current scientific language or the current structural language describes. So they depended on poetry. And I think Sufi poetry, for example, will be relevant for years after our current scientific method is relevant. Not to shit on our current scientific method. It's our current language. It's the language we need to rigorously go through. It's the language we need to really expound upon. And I think there's value in it. But they ended at poetry because as you touch those states, you can share them with people around you and you can kind of get that ball rolling of other people experiencing it, and hopefully that community builds generation after generation. And that lesson holds, or that new communication form evolves, or you can try to write it down. And I think the history of people trying to write it down is comical. If you look at Descartes talking about dualism, it's kind of funny now. We look at him and we say, he said, "I think, therefore I am," and that was this. And he didn't just say that. He used rigid logical structure to come to that as the lowest common state that can denote you being. And then, Hobbes made fun of him by saying, "Well, I walk, therefore I am." And then we just all, like college grad students in philosophy, just laugh at that. And they laugh at so many other things because the structural form of expressing those profound states of the time is both the language is going to change, the fundamental meaning of words is going to change, the context is going to change. You can only assure yourself to be comical and maybe historically relevant when you do that. When you and the goal is not history. Again, the goal is not history. The goal, I think, is to truly communicate with the person across from you and find ways other than language. Not because language is inappropriate, because I think when you meditate, when you quiet your state to other ways of your being expressing itself, little fundamental seeds of other languages, of other ways of being reveal themselves. And we need to just accept that we're going to be 33-year-olds or 35-year-olds at our spoken language, and we might be 3-year-olds at this language, and it's okay. The same way that it's okay if you want to pick up and learn the guitar at 35. And we haven't been given permission to do, because there's this, if you don't learn piano or guitar by 20 or by 12, you're done. There's never going to be a chance. Yeah. And the reason is less to do with you not being able to learn it and more to do with your average speaking skills of smell, of sight, of language, of body language is at a level of a 21-year-old. And it's so hurtful and actually your hearing and appreciation of music is at a 22-year-old. Your ability to then play at a 3-year-old is so jarring, is so alarming, and so just like you feel, you judge yourself and you're like, this sounds horrible and I suck at this, and you don't even allow yourself to build up on it. Yeah.
I remember when I started to learn to play the guitar when I was 20. I was in college, or maybe I might have been 21 even. I was tired of being jealous of the guy that could play the guitar. Yeah. And so I was like, all right, dude, there's 2 fucking ways out of this. 1, you get off of it, or 2, you fucking learn. Yeah. And I was like, I'm going to learn. And I remember a friend of mine took me to, when I bought my first guitar, and we walk into the Guitar Center in San Diego, and, I'm picking up these guitars. They all sounded the same to me. Yeah. I couldn't hear the difference. Right. And she was bringing other ones, and the guy was bringing these guitars, and like, what do you think, and whatever. And I was just like, whoa, this one looks, I was making some shit up, but like, I didn't hear a fucking difference at all. And I'm not a good guitar player, but like, I've been around, I've picked up the instrument enough now that like, I can hear differences, you
Yeah.
know, and like, but that it's just an interesting thing of like, what do you evolve into, and like, just, you know, pushing through stuff. Anyway, I want to ask you, before we get too far down another rabbit hole. So with all of this communication stuff, do you have like an example of like something that maybe like in a relationship that you've been in where you've just felt such an impasse in communication, or like, you know, what is it like for somebody to date you? You know, like if there's someone listening to this and she wants to date you, and it's like, what the fuck does she do with that? You know, just be like, well, we're going to like do a bunch of drugs and like maybe communicate on that level? Or is it like, I mean, I don't know. Like, so what is that like?
Yeah, I mean, I answer that question first with like an advanced apology. No, but I don't think it's that extreme. I don't think it's this idea of like we push ourselves. We see how we can find discomfort, and that reveals. And I really don't even think it's those languages are in psychedelic states. Mm-hmm. What advice would I give to someone dating me?
Take a moment.
I think it reveals itself. Like, I think it's this ability to sit in a moment and see how that moment reveals itself. Mm-hmm. And, you know, before we came in here, I said, hey, what are we going to talk about? How are we going to talk about it? And I really needed meaning. You'd be uncomfortable. You'd be like, I like to talk, and I hope that you know me enough and you can gauge the situation enough when we're talking to see when I'm glazing over, mm-hmm. or when I'm appreciating it, or when like you're monopolizing the conversation on my fucking podcast.
You're the guest,
right?
Be here, yeah.
And, but so that's the important thing. I think mm-hmm. it's this attunement, and it's not all attunement, because sometimes you want to play sheet music and you learn a lot from playing sheet music, mm-hmm. and sometimes you want to jazz improv, mm-hmm. and I think it's this understanding or getting, for the most part, on the same page about when we want to play some sheet music and when we want to do what one does, mm-hmm. Which is important. Like you can't just improvise. Nobody became a really great jazz musician by just improvising. It's an illusion, and it's mm-hmm. one that's really romantic, and it sounds amazing. It's just like all I do is improvise. But that person played his ass off. He played his chords. He understood, or they understood, the technicality of that. They did what one must do. They did the mm-hmm. things that you do on dates. You take it slow. You go on, to places where people should go for the most part, and you do things they should do. You don't go too crazy, because that's the context of where we are. Not mm-hmm. saying that there's something like platonically ideal about going to a restaurant and having fermented grapes and food that's served on a cotton fiber. There's nothing platonically significant about that, but that's where we are.
Yeah.
And you have to acknowledge that state. But you also have to play with the unknown, mm-hmm. and you have to improvise, and you have to play jazz. And I think that, and it's not a prescription for people. It's really just like, do we want to be there? Mm-hmm. And that's part of the game we play when we meet new people. It's like, okay, you can't just ask that. You can't be like, I need somebody who improvises and is really open to new experiences. And like when you do that, it's really, you get really bad stuff. You get stuff that's like what's spontaneous is us going to like the new place that got written up on something else, and right. that everybody's going to, and not that there's anything wrong with going to a place everyone's going to, but it becomes prescriptive. And when you try to improvise in a prescriptive way, you lose the point of improvisation. Mm-hmm. And we have these beautiful instruments that, you might play the guitar, I might play the drums, and learning to play them together is an interesting thing. And mm-hmm. it's not me telling you like, okay, I want a bandmate that plays just 80s butt rock and it really knows their like ballads. It's about finding out, okay, where's my skill set? Where's your skill set? How do we play together? What is our styles? And it's fairly indirect. Mm-hmm. And the beautiful parts come when the indirect communication pushes up to its boundaries, and you're still, I was going to say vulnerable, but we're not. Yeah. When you're still, when you're still open enough to explore that.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
One of the things that I use with my coaching clients all the time is that I think the greatest, to be bold, right? The greatest kind of mindset and attitude to have in life really is one of curiosity.
Yeah.
And when I think about like my marriage and like one of the things that we sort of had a disconnect on was that like we didn't connect with the same level of curiosity.
Yeah.
I felt like she lived in a state of knowing, and I find myself perpetually in a state of being curious. That's why I love having the podcast now, because it's just like, what the fuck do you think?
Yeah.
And part of why I've really enjoyed this sort of experiment or diving into some of the psychedelics and even with some of these just marijuana edibles too, is because there's an element of, well, let's just see what happens. Not to be reckless, but
Yeah.
it's like I really appreciate that, and like one of the things that I love about Jen is this, her willingness to go into some levels of discomfort, to be a little curious, and be like, well, let's see what happens,
So I see you have the Michael Pollan book right
I
on the
just
top
got
of
it.
your
I haven't
shelf.
read it
Did
yet.
you? Okay.
Have you read it?
I have.
Yeah, it came yesterday.
Nice.
Yeah. Is it good?
It's good. It's good.
Yeah.
It's worth reading.
Yeah.
He's a fascinating writer, and I got introduced to him through food. And being a tough critic of food, like working in food science and reading a lot of the studies that he talks about, reading things like Omnivore's Dilemma, reading things like The Botany of Desire, I appreciated his ability to not talk in absolutes, but give a summary of very nuanced scientific studies, which is so hard to do, especially in food, because the truth is our knowledge of nutrition in the scientific field is really, really, really limited. And that's the one thing that I think nobody's willing to really talk about is we don't know.
Yeah.
There's so much we don't know. And he leans on the side of established science, but he also he does his work in research. And I think this book was really fascinating because I can't think of a better way to write a book on this subject, on psychedelics, in the way he wrote it and in the way that he looked at perspectives. Now, the big question for me is whether we're ready for it and whether there's a bit of opening of Pandora's box before we're ready for it. But it's been written. Yeah. It's there. It's I think, quite popular.
Yeah.
Right?
It seems to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also,
we roll in a very unique circle.
We do. Yeah.
I don't know if
book readers,
if Georgia. I don't know if South Carolina, it's like flying off the shelves.
Yeah. I mean,
maybe. Hopefully. I mean, I haven't read it yet. So
it could be. Who knows? It's
no
a
offense to
fascinating
South Carolina.
Yeah,
I'm
no,
sure you guys are all amazing. Yeah, just dropping mushrooms.
Great.
From
Yeah.
the backyard. Yeah.
Actually, I think I don't know if South Carolina has any wild growing psilocybin mushrooms, but it's another subject. But it's interesting how that conversation becomes exposed right now. Right, we're much more willing to have it, and there are cynical ways to see that, and there are hopeful ways to see that. I'm not sure just yet where I land.
Yeah.
Part of me has read a little too much history and wonders whether this kind of thing allows a web that otherwise was a little more clandestine to become a little too outward.
Sure.
And that scares me a little bit.
Yeah.
Not personally for myself, but it scares me for this idea that there are people who are doing this work and they're doing it thoughtfully and they're putting in, they're willing to speak in the language of our current times.
Yeah.
For example, MAPS. That group is very fascinating in that they've actually looked at the current system of working with the FDA, working with drug approvals, and they said, you know what? If this is what it takes, we're going to do it this way. And I think a lot of people in the late 60s did that too. And some people didn't. And they didn't for the right reasons, because they looked at it and they said, this is fucked up. This is something that has been common knowledge. This is something people have safely done for years. This is not a scourge on society. This is not destructive to our way of being. And they pushed it. And not to their fault. I think they deserved to push it. I think they weren't wrong to push it. But the consequence was we had almost 40 years of prohibition. And I always wonder, like when you push something that you know is right in a context where the time is not right.
Yeah.
And it, goes to the relationship. You might have met somebody who's on your same level and on your same page and you guys vibe together, but there's one place where you want to be here and she's over here and you're like, look, I'm just going to give you the answer. Like, this is the place to be.
Right.
Right. And it creates trauma. It creates some
or vulnerability. It's a huge one. Like certainly with dating, where it's like people are like they reveal like way too much way too soon,
too quickly.
and they're just like, you're it, and like we vibe and it's great. So like here's this like horrible shit that happened to me, and it's like
I don't have the tools to deal with that right now.
Yeah, it's just not right. Like it's the timing wasn't right. It's like it wasn't. There's like a time and a place in the delivery and like and all of that, and it's there's what is it like? I mean, context matters, right?
Context matters, and I think there's a danger to opening that box, that psychedelic box, a little sooner than it should be open. But look, you're always going to think that, right? When you're pushing through a boundary, when you're on the other side of the boundary, there's always going to be we could stay here a little longer. We can shed this shell a little bit later. It's a little uncomfortable. So that's one of my curiosities on it. And the other one is, one that's kind of speculative, but one that's kind of just how I fundamentally feel about altered states or holistic states or states where you connect with something higher than where we are being. And that's that I genuinely believe that language, for example, song, language, these basic ways of creating a state or creating something were at one point as powerful as psychedelics.
Like you're talking about like Kundalini or like breath work?
I'm talking about talking. I'm talking about words, and I'm talking about song, and I'm talking about something when it was so foreign to emit a sound from another human in a space that's quiet, where we're sitting across from each other, when we're not picking berries, when we're not hunting lions, when we're just to sit there and create a sound. Use the bevel of a shell to create a whistle. I think those states may have been as psychedelic as the most powerful substances we have now. And I think there's something about taking those and making them mundane that's inevitable. It's going to happen. You can't say, we have to keep language sacred like this. It's going to happen. It's going to open itself up. And even in the near history, in written history, we have documentation of cannabis being a transcendental, like God touching or a spirit touching state. There was a tribe of the Hashashins, which were the name assassin came from. There were this group of people who were highly radicalized through potentially psychedelic states on hashish. There are other descriptions that we have within the last few thousand years of having documented records of altered states on something as simple as cannabis that are much more profound than anything we are touching right now. And I think there's something like there's a reticular way in which our biochemistry responds to stimulus that changes collectively. And I genuinely think that potentially, something like psilocybin mushrooms in 100 years maybe will not have the same effect, will not have a transcendental effect. There will be maybe that lower level of the effect. Maybe there will be some effect, but those other set of effects that they could have, that they do have, might not be there just because of the relationship in which we comport ourselves to them. And this goes back to this idea that we rely on solutions, we rely on structural answers of our being without an understanding of the way that we adapt. And I really believe that a lot of those substances, when they get introduced to a larger population, will lose their power or will alter their power. And whether that's a good thing, because then we'll be curious about learning or building our relationship with other plants. And most of these things come from plants, even the synthetic compounds. LSD is a derivative of ergot, which is a fungus that grows on rye. And it's actually believed that a lot of the old like witchcraft scares, a lot of kykeon, which was used in the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece, may have been derivatives of this particular fungus that grows on rye. So they are plant compounds that we have an opportunity to communicate with, which, speaking of other modes of communication, that communication with plants, I think, is a really important one, both in their presence, the biochemical sense that they evoke that we can respond to, and also the biochemical relationship between ingesting that chemical. But yeah, those are things that make me think when I see, when I see that door being much more broadly open.
And as a food chemist, when you're like creating a new product, does that come into consideration at all? Like with mass exposure to this formulation, might an experience or a sense of taste change or something like that?
Yeah, completely. I think there's things that, we create little concept silos of flavor. If a client doesn't say they want to do this ginger molasses mate ginseng combination, and we love it, and we see something, and we put it on the back burner because we know that statement is gonna connect to people. But actually, ginger is a great example because for the 50 years, Americans drank a very particular flavor of ginger ale that I would challenge you to find a ginger flavor in ginger ale. It really doesn't have it. It doesn't have the gingerol compound, the one that like burns and gives you that sensation. It doesn't have that brightness. It just is not ginger. But we were cool with it for a long time. And that's changed a little bit recently. We're people who pick up a product that says ginger, at least in Whole Foods, at least in the natural space, they want a kick and they want to feel that ginger and they want to know it's ginger. And in that sense, like, you can sense that even in 10 years, which is really fun. And once you get really like into playing with flavors and you test it with enough people and maybe this person won't like it, you get a little mischievous about knowing what's going to pop up next, with whether it's cayenne or whether it's, these combinations of adaptogens. And you start kind of planting the seed here and there. And you start, letting the idea start going in a certain place, but you have to be careful not to put it in the wrong place. And the wrong place is just a place that, whether it's NDA or a non-compete, will not allow you to do it again. And it's not going to be nurtured. So, for example, like we'll talk with big multinational beverage companies that will say, we want to do a CBD product. And they don't want to do a CBD product. That like the radar of whether it's Google searches or spin studies or different studies that are taking place are showing, well, this is on a trend. And they're like, the next marketing exercise is explore CBD, explore, what products we can make with that. But if the environment, when things unfold and where they can and can't, you don't send it there. And you send it to places where, like, for example, right now, CBD, which is a non-psychoactive cannabinoid in cannabis and actually exists in hemp, which is legal for the most part right now. We're figuring it out. There's companies that are willing to really let that grow, and they're willing to embrace it and explore what the possibilities of it are. And those companies will nurture it, and there'll be a little feedback among their customers, among the stores. And a lot of the time, it actually starts up not legally. And I don't mean not legally, like overtly not legally. But for example, 10 years ago, cold pressed juice was not legal. Like there was no context in which the FDA had for that, for literally taking juice, pressing it fresh, putting it in a bottle, and selling it to you at the store. The FDA said, we have no context for this. You can't do this. So people did it, and they did it legally, and they did it long enough because they cared. But Coca-Cola wasn't doing it. The big companies weren't doing it. Even if they saw that it was a trend, they just weren't touching it. So that context and playing with where that new thing belongs is, for me, a lot of fun. And playing with a lot of ideas and not being overly attached to them. Like, I genuinely believe that creativity, flavors, and creation of new products is like a muscle. the more you work it, the stronger it gets, the better it gets. And I never feel bad about giving away an idea, especially if I know that somebody's going to steward it and they're going to take care of it and they're going to love it and it's going to be their little thing. I do that. And I'll do that over giving it to somebody who's got a lot of money and who thinks that this is a emerging trend.
Right. Yeah, the food stuff is like fascinating to me because I was so sick for so long. I just became really afraid of food.
In general,
I was afraid to eat. I mean, I grew up in the in the Midwest.
You didn't eat, or you ate the same thing because you didn't know how variability would. Okay,
yeah, I was both. Wow. So I mean, I grew up in the Midwest, like super plain diet, like meat, potatoes, fucking chicken, like every day, and like simple stuff. My parents hated cheese. My dad hated cheese, so we never had cheese in the house. So it was like fucking bland and like simple. And then when I got really sick, I just became like mortified of food. I was afraid to eat because like food became the enemy. If I ate, it meant I had to shit. And if I had to shit, I was going to shit blood. And it was like, or it'd be super urgent. And like, it was this way every day for like 8 years. Really intense. So I already went with like a low level of food knowledge. And then it just became like bottom. I would make congee. I think we talked about this a while ago. I would make congee, the overcooked rice, overnight. And that was like the base that I would, it's usually steam some chicken. And like, I would find what would sort of be like the least offensive thing.
Yeah. And you made the congee the day before.
Yeah, the day before, and I'd reheat it, and like that seemed to be okay, And like I just referred to the classics where Chinese medicine was like congee is what they would make to wean babies off of breast milk and start them into like solid foods, and so they give them this like overcooked, reheated rice, and so so now that I was like starting to feel better, it was like okay, it was like this sort of slow coming back to food, and then living here in New York, where I eat out like a bunch, and I've just discovered more food, that it's been really fascinating, like developing an appreciation for just like a variety of flavors that before I'd really shut myself off to. And like Jen will tell you that when we first started dating, one of her fears about dating me was that like she loves to eat, and she was like, I don't know if I could be with somebody who's like afraid of food, and it's been such a delight to like reawaken to senses and to like appreciate flavor and taste. It's actually a little bit like the guitar now that I think about it. Like I'm appreciating more sort of notes than I ever did before. And when I worked at Canyon Ranch, I remember the head chef there, he came and he gave us a little talk in our medical department. And he was describing, he said, the typical American palate, their tongue is used to two flavors, salt and fat.
Yeah.
He's like, they coat the tongue with fat and then you get some salt.
Right.
And he was like, and
sugar sometimes.
And sugar, right. And he's like, this is like fucking years ago, so I might be butchering it. But what I remember was he was like, the fat food in the American diet just covers the entire surface of the tongue. And he was like, and that creates a particular sensation to the consumer. And he was like, so as we're trying to prepare meals that don't have all of that unhealthy fat, he's like, what we do is that I make sure that every meal activates every part of the tongue.
Yeah.
And he was like, so we have all of the flavors in all of the meals so that the consumer, the person eating it, gets that activation of all the regions of the tongue.
Yeah.
Because we can't just have a spicy food that doesn't have these other flavors, because it's like just like on the sensation of the tongue, it's unsatisfying.
Yeah.
I thought that was so cool because I wasn't thinking about that shit. I was just like, how do I not shit myself?
No. Well, yeah, because you were dealing with a traumatic state, and your context of taste was overshadowed by, controlling your body going out of control.
Right.
And I think that's an interesting exercise to start playing with, giving people the credit of tasting those subtle things. And I think it starts with babies, for example. There was a baby product we worked on that introduced spices. And spices are one of the most profound things that we can play with. Like our nose, there's probably, as far as we know, as far as input, output, our olfactory sense is the most sensitive thing that we know of in our body. It can detect chemicals that we've been working on machines to be able to create or chemical studies, chemical tests that we're just able to detect. Now we don't know it. So for example, hydrogen sulfide, we can detect in I think it's something like 1 part per 20 million, that molecule per 20 million other molecules we can detect. And there's other things that we can start enjoying and appreciating that we do in later life, whether it's cinnamon, vanilla. Like, wars were fought for this shit once people like, and the problem is we don't introduce those things early on to people, where for whatever reason, and some of them are active compounds, like eugenol in cloves is not a subtle compound. It's a compound that can have effects on our tissue. It can have effects on our internal organs. And so we can be a little careful with that. But introducing kids to something other than sugar, salt, fat, and spice and bitterness, even that is giving too much credit for what we actually introduce people to, is fascinating. And allowing that to grow and allowing that to develop is, I think, something that's important. And I think it's important in more than just nutrition. We're learning now that there are scents that actually have really direct psychological or physiological effects. For example, smelling basil has an energizing effect. You can take basil and you can smell it, and there are studies that are double-blind studies that show that people actually have a energizing effect that's as similar to caffeine, not same intensity, but it works in a different mechanism that we haven't been versed in yet. Rosemary, for example, there's studies that show that memory, recall, cognitive abilities are actually improved by just the scent of rosemary.
Have you seen the one about, I could be totally fucking this up, I'll blame the mezcal, about grapefruit and people's perception of body weight?
No.
We should probably look it up, but fuck it.
Let's make it up.
Yeah, we'll make it up.
Yeah, we'll make a study.
People that smell grapefruit and then they guess somebody's weight consistently underguess when they smell the grapefruit.
Dinner party. Yeah. Right. Grapefruit. I didn't know that. I'm gonna look into that.
Yeah,
That's
we should look.
cool.
Well, we won't look it up.
But no, but there's an interesting thing about that, because body dysmorphia is something we don't understand very well. And that's people's extreme perceptions of their bodies. And you'll have people do sketches of what their body looks like, and you'll have and people who are going through this state, and it's not. We've clumped it under depression. We've clumped it under other states. We've clumped it under the addictive states of eating disorders. But body dysmorphia is complex, and it affects the person themselves, and it affects their perception of other people as well. And to think that there might be a sensory input that is not, again, that doesn't act in the traditional sense that we think chemicals act on our biological system, which is you ingest them, they go through, they affect neurotransmitters, they affect the biochemistry of your gut or the way that the rest of your body works. They work on a sensory level where your olfactory bulb triggers something. That's interesting to me, and that's fascinating. Yeah, and it's fascinating not just in food, but in aromas. Like if you look at the fragrance world, they're shaking in their boots a little bit. There's 3 companies that make every single fragrance you've ever touched in your life. And consumers now are interested in exploring one note. And even that one note, like you smell Palo Santo, for example. And there is so many different chemical compounds in that. And how you grow that tree will dictate how it's expressing those different compounds. And what those compounds do to you physiologically is not really talked about. But for Palo Santo, for example, is an interesting one, because when the conquistadors came to South America, they in churches were burning myrrh and frankincense, which is a resin from the Middle East. From I think it grows from everywhere from northern Africa through where the Fertile Crescent used to be, and it's pretty valuable resin. It takes a lot of work to allow that tree to grow, to collect it. They found that they couldn't ship it here because the transportation took a long time, but they couldn't find anything analogous here. What they did find was this tree they called Palo Santo, which could be used as an analog for that particular scent. Cool. And there was something about that scent. There was something about that, whether it's the biochemical effect, whether it's the description of that scent, that was enough to trigger them to continue that tradition, thousands-year-old tradition, to use that as an analog to myrrh and frankincense.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, and I don't think we talk about it enough. We try to optimize aromas, and you've got immensely trained people who are called noses, by the way, who they can recognize a molecule. They can say, there's diacetyl in this, which is essentially when you break down the scent compound of any product, it's got all these little molecules, but usually there's one or two that spike. And we say that's butter or that's raspberry. Diacetyl happens to be this like butter note, this like toasty butter note. So you'll get that in Chardonnays, you'll get that in like toasted wood oak. You'll get it in places where there's no butter whatsoever, but they go, these people will smell things and they'll be like, okay, these molecules are in here. And we ended at that. We're like, all right, let's make something pleasant. I think there's something fascinating in
give people some comfort.
Right. and honestly, for me, like most of the aromas, most of the fragrances right now are really overwhelming.
Yeah.
They're offensive and they're not interesting. And they're not interesting in the sense that I can't actually talk to them. And I can't say, there's a lemon note there. I remember that. There's this note and there's this note. And I can't actually engage with them because they're so polished and they're so balanced out in a way that creates something new, and it's beautiful and it's interesting. But for me, I'm more fascinated with what the 50 different types of aroma the Palo Santo tree can create than I am with the new scent you can create using that and 20 other compounds from all around the world that frankly I don't have a conversation with. I don't, they don't inspire me all that much.
This has been such a joy for me in the last year and a half, 2 years, but especially even in the last 6 months where I've really dived deeper into the essential oils.
Yeah.
Jen and I have been doing a lot of the doTERRA stuff. And as I've been reading, the book under the How to Change Your Mind is all about essential oils. It's Dr. X's books. Have you seen this one?
I haven't.
Looking at the essential oils and just studying how they impact the body and how it is. And doTERRA is such a phenomenal company because of their preservation for quality.
Yeah.
Their commitment to quality and being the highest quality that there is. And also at the convention this year, they talked about how they're spearheading sustainable harvesting of frankincense, and they can track the batch, if I remember right, the batch of the bottle that you have, back to the tree where it came from. They're bringing it to that level because they know that frankincense is so important and it's so valuable, and harvesting of it is it's critical. But one of the things that I thought was so cool that I just had never thought about or learned about was that when people are making perfumes, there's essential oils and aromas that are short lasting, the medium lasting, and the long lasting.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the combination of the two to give you that effect. And from what I remember, vetiver and patchouli are long lasting smells. So those can be the base.
Yeah.
But then also how that base changes over the course of a few hours. How something, even if it's an individual oil, how it smells at first contact versus an hour or half hour later or an hour later.
Yeah.
I think all of that stuff is it's fascinating.
Yeah. There's actually techniques of taking the quicker compounds, ones that just evaporate really quickly or that disappear or that change, and actually binding them to something else and letting them emerge slower. And there's a lot of the scent industry. There's there's the really fascinating book that's about the history of poppies, but it uses the history of poppies as a secondary study of things how the pharmaceutical industry started, and a lot of it started from dyes and scents, because 150 years ago, that's what they were doing. They were sending people all around the world. They were what we now call ethnobotanists. They were sending people who could find a compound or a plant or molecule and get a color out of it. There's a whole story about how the cochineal beetle in Mexico, there was 200 years of people trying to steal it and grow it elsewhere because that red color couldn't be made anywhere else.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of those industries came from, and they came from different motivations. They came from, one was food, one was making food palatable that otherwise wasn't, and others were sense. People being able to, showering and cleanliness was not what it was before. And the other was pure novelty, and obviously clothes. Being able to get a color that stays red or stays purple, whatever was in trend at the time, was so incredibly important. And then these were the companies that then evolved into your Bayers and into your larger chemical companies. And I'm fascinated with what the future of that is going to be based on its history. And my hope is that we're going to tap back into the source, and we're going to tap back into what those plants are expressing themselves. And we're going to say, okay, what is vetiver? What is frankincense? And how is it that they can be grown differently, and how we can use them differently? And, maybe frankincense is not something you put on at 8 a.m. in the morning and it's going to have that effect until 5, 6 p.m. But what else is it about that compound that, and this goes back to Michael Pollan's book, The Botany of Desire. He talks about how plants enslave us for their purpose, for that they use chemicals to spread their purpose. And that conversation is fascinating. And I really hope that the future food scientists, the future flavor makers, the future botanists and farmers really get that curious spark and play with that, rather than, I don't find it too interesting to see, how you can take 15 compounds and slightly altered chemical versions of them and put them together into a new smell that nobody's ever smelled before that's alluring. It's interesting and it's fascinating, but I think what's so much more fascinating is to actually engage with the living beings around us, and some of those being plants, some of those being fungi, some of those being animals, and understanding what those chemicals are messaging and what the other languages that we might potentially be overlooking might be.
What do you think the impact is of having these synthetically derived smells and foods and some of the chemical manipulations of these things? What do you think the impact is on the body?
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
And studies that matter don't have the kind of time frame that's important. There's a sensational retelling of a study today that came out that talks about there being a 25% reduction in cancer occurrence in people who eat organics versus who don't. And just that statement alone has so many questions in it.
Yeah.
Right. It's just like, I can't be prescriptive about it. I think there's things, sometimes it's curious for us to do things and play with them. I'm always a proponent of us exploring and us playing around. But the way that commerce presses on exploration is a little too intense in the food and biochem world. And I don't know the biochem world too well, really, through anecdotal evidence, but I do know the food world enough to know that the studies that are funded very, very, there's a very thin veil between the corporate interest and the productive interest of the funding that takes place for a lot of studies, a lot of these kids who, want to put together a food science study, and what they have to do, right? Because they're looking to get jobs at a lot of these companies.
Sure.
The world of, food scientists is not, it's not that lucrative, it's not that broad, it's not that interesting. There's I can count the companies on my hand of where people really want to work. And those are companies that do a lot of the funding. Not only do they do a lot of the funding, but they do a lot of the hiring of government officials, people who've worked in the FDA or people who then go into the FDA.
Right.
So it's tough, and you can't regulate your way out of it necessarily. You have to, give a fuck your way out of it. That's really, I think, the important thing. And, my hope is that the folks who work for us, the folks we work for, that they get inspired and that they care. And that my hope is that, we give people the benefit of the doubt of caring about the real reason why they want to be a chemist or a scientist. And, if you look at the history of scientists, they're fucking deviants. And you look at some of these guys, they were fucking doing hilarious fucked up shit that just really is not like it's not your standard route to tenure. It really isn't. Like the people that really change the world are fucking deviants.
What example is coming to mind right now?
I mean, so many. I mean, Humphrey Davy and James Maxwell Clerk and even like Tesla and even guys you go back to, the beginning of the shift of this scientific rationalist way of thinking. You look at Newton. You look at even Darwin. He was a guy who kind of was supposed to go into seminary school and escaped and kind of went on a boat. And he was just this weird, fucking awkward kid who just liked to look at bugs. Yeah. And they were like, fuck. And his dad was like, just send him off somewhere.
Yeah, I remember that.
These are people who like, and right now that feedback, back then the feedback might have been his dad and some, people he closely knew who really ostracized him. But right now, that feedback loop is shorter, and I find it I look at how, kids get inspired and don't right now, and their feedback loop of shame and of feedback on whether they're doing something interesting or not, I think is shorter and more critical. Again, I don't get a chance to say that because I'm not part of that culture, and I think something more interesting always emerges from these new ways of communication, from these new formats of being and of having stress and of, challenging ourselves through that. But I really do think that we don't value the unproductive deviance as much as we should. And think back on the guy who was impractical enough to utilize the precious cooking fire to put rocks in it and then to hammer metal out of that. That was I'm guessing somebody didn't sit down and say, I have this great theory, we're going to do this. And that's the other prejudice we have. That's this fundamental prejudice of we're Homo sapiens. We are thinkers and then we're doers. Like we plan something, we make a great plan, we execute it. There was a great book written in the 1920s called Homo Ludens, and it's man the player, the man the game engager. And it's this idea that we play in unbound ways and we push ourselves, and from that something emerges that we can then maybe explain. And I think that's the direction of exploration rather than you just sit down and you plan it and you make a good system, and then you can figure out how to get metal out of stones. You got to get that ore out of there, or you can figure out, and it's such a, I think, just inhibiting fundamental prejudice we have on how things are discovered.
So reductionist. When I remember when I was an anthropology major in college, and this guy that was in my program, he was a PhD student. He was his whole dissertation was going to be on the discovery of fire and how when man figured out how to control and maintain the flame, what impact that might have had in development and brain chemistry and the different extraction of nutrients from your food and all of that stuff. Yeah, but somebody had to find fire or they had to make it, and then they had to be let me put my food over it and let's just see what happens. So if you, it's the Pleasure Points podcast, right? So we'll bring it back. So what advice would you give to somebody, even like myself, who wanted to experience or explore more kind of flavor and enjoyment of their food and what they're ingesting? What would you suggest?
Eat quieter foods.
What does that mean?
So imagine you're in a club and the bass is just blasting and this volume is really high up, and somebody opens their phone up and they play you a Leonard Cohen song, and they're like, you got to listen to this, just the voice of this guy. You're going to hear nothing, right? That's not to say that there's not a time and place for high amplitude, high intensity experiences, but we depend on detection of novelty through amplitude. And I think that's dangerous because our detection at high amplitudes of intensity of differences becomes much lower. We can tell the differences much less. Now, when you go into something that's quieter, something that's more nuanced, something that's more delicate, and then that's not to say it's something that's pretentious and you get a little spoon of it while you're just being highly uncomfortable. No, that's I don't think that's it. But I think it's seeking quieter experiences. And in that you're generally going to be able to find nuances. There, again, it's a overt prescription that doesn't necessarily always play out in the same way that struggle doesn't always lead to growth. But generally, when you quiet things down and you focus on a quieter experience of food, of ingestion, of flavor, you're going to notice things you didn't notice before. And once you do that, you're going to notice things you like that you didn't notice before. And you're going to be able to unfold those, and you're going to be able to explore them and maybe, read about why, suddenly I like allspice. Why do I like allspice? What's in allspice? What other chemical compounds are in there? And, nowadays you can Wikipedia this stuff, and it's fascinating how much information is on this. If you really want to do, if you find out you like allspice, what else is allspice in? Why do I like allspice? What flavor chemical compounds are in there? And you go like, oh, okay, this is in here, this eggnog, maybe I liked eggnog before. Like, it becomes a conversation. Whereas, if we go to a place that's got the spicier wings, or we go to the place that's got like, the most intense Hunan noodles, it's loud. Yeah. And there's a time and place for it. But I don't think you build appreciation for virtuosity by over engaging in high intensity or high amplitude experience within a particular sense, whether it's sound and music, whether it's taste, whether it's smell.
I love that. I was visiting my brother who lives in Wisconsin, and it's a fucking chemical shitstorm over there. Yeah. His house is just like chemical fucking everything.
In what sense?
Cleaners, fucking like the air fresheners, like the fucking Glade shit, and it's everywhere, just like and it's like it just has this like chemical quality. I mean, it's like there was like I didn't see any fruit in the house, right? And there was just like it was just really intense, but it was like, especially because I've been doing so much of like the natural sort of doTERRA shit that like my appreciation for subtlety has like gone through the roof. And so like these chemical smells were just they're so overbearing. And I was like, there's no room for subtlety here. There's no room for like quiet thought inside this smell of this laundry detergent. I did laundry at their house, and I came here and I like put on a pair of jeans that I'd washed, and I couldn't tolerate myself.
You could smell it walking on the street, right?
Yeah. I was sitting here trying to do a fucking podcast, and I was just like, oh, fuck. I took them off, and I was like, I got to wash these in like natural shit. It was crazy. But I love that idea of like, I like how you said quieter food. Have you been to Lilia, the restaurant?
Love it.
So good,
really
right?
Good. They just opened a place called Missy. That's right down.
That's what I heard.
Yeah, that's like a pasta-based place. But you were saying Jen.
We just like she walked past it and was like, "Oh, what's this place? We should go there." And so then we had a date night there, and I was talking to a client of mine about it, and she's like, "Dude, that's like the hottest restaurant in town." Like
they do a great job. I mean, they do.
It was so. We got this focaccia bread that had this like these chili flakes on top. That was like so fucking good. It was amazing.
They do a fantastic job.
Yeah.
The few times I can get in there, because it's very difficult to get in there.
That's what she said. We walked. I mean, we had like the ARP reservation. We just walked over like 6
p.m. on a Tuesday.
That was like 6 o'clock on like a Wednesday, and it was fine. But anyway, go ahead.
Nice. No, I love it. I think they have a really great wine list. I think what they're doing is, they make their pasta by hand, and they're getting in an environment where everyone's poo-pooing pasta and starches. Right. They're just outwardly good. Like, you know what, we're going to do this. And
it was an old auto body shop that they renovated.
Was it?
Yeah. 3 years ago, it was an auto body shop, and now it's this like badass restaurant in the corner.
And they actually have soft serve ice cream in the back, which is really nice.
I heard about that afterwards. I didn't know. And then when Jen and I were in Hawaii, we were doing a retreat there, and the place that we stayed in Kauai, they served this butter that was like coated in some kind of like passion flower thing. Yeah, it was so good when they served
butter.
it.
I'm by the way, I'm picturing butter like dusted in flowers right now. So
yeah, it was like it, but it looked like gelato. Like when they brought it out with the bread, I was like, "Is this dessert?" Because it looked and it tasted like gelato.
And you dipped something into it.
Yeah, but they served it with bread, and I was like, "That's got to be butter." But it was like it had this like this passion flower.
It's like a custard of some sort. No?
I don't even know, dude. It was so fucking good. It was delicious.
All right.
Yeah.
Do you know what it was called?
I can find out. I'll reach out to the lady at the place and she's like, "What was that shit?" Because it was so good. I mean, I'm still talking about it. It's like 5 months later, you know.
Western palate or like American palates and Hawaii can be challenging. You know, there's so many really unique flavors in Hawaii. I'm super curious what that is. My guess is it's some sort of custard, but
yeah, I'll find out.
Cool.
Yeah, it was amazing. Awesome, dude. Well, we're fucking 2 hours deep into this.
All right.
This is great. Let's
we got 2 more going. We'll just let's wrap it up. Bye.
We'll have you back. We didn't even talk about like men's shit and all that stuff. So we'll do this again.
Right.
Thank you so much for coming.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Any final thoughts, ways you want people to connect with you?
Just thank you. And I really enjoyed the conversation. And, you know, I can't wait to hear kind of where this evolves and what the other conversations come up. And I hope I'll still be able to get acupuncture time with you after this blows up.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. You're fucking amazing. My time in New York, it's having met you and hanging out with you is a total highlight. So thank you so much for coming on. And for the rest of you guys out there, thanks for listening. If you made it this far, you're the best. And catch you next time.